Welcome to The Deep End by On Deck, a podcast where visionary builders, creators, and experts discuss world-changing ideas. I'm your host, Marshall Kozlov. Let's dive in.
You're choosing for example, an Allbirds for a reason. Most of these D2C brands have just like a few SKUs when they start out, or just like one product. And so you really like that. And ideally, if you're a D2C brand, you're really like milking that interest. You understand exactly what the customer wants. You can produce a new product or introduce like subscriptions or other things that will keep them and increase their LTV. And I think with all these like new acquisition channels or, increasing costs, like you do have to focus on how you're treating your existing customers so that they don't get bought by another brand, essentially. Really, nowadays, people are just buying customers.
At The Deep End, we're creating a space where we skip the surface level and go in depth into ideas that inspire people to build. I'll be your guide as we explore possible futures of internet communities, creator tools, climate tech, longevity, and much, much more. There are no experts in uncharted territory, only pioneers. The Deep End invites these trailblazers to turn their experiences into the knowledge and ideas that others need to start their own founder odysseys. Joining me this week in The Deep End is Sara, co-founder and CEO of Alloy Automation, a no-code tool for automating e-commerce stores. Our conversation begins by discussing how the line between commerce and e-commerce is blurring as e-commerce penetration continues to accelerate across the consumer economy. This trend was certainly accelerated by the pandemic, but Sara notes that Black Friday shopping patterns and other indicators have long suggested that such a shift was inevitable anyways. Our conversation then moved on to the power of no-code tools and their potential applications to help unlock value for small businesses without engineering teams. Sara thinks that Alloy can be for commerce what Zapier is for tech. Finally, we discussed the implications of automation itself. Does it replace jobs or augment current ones? Sara is also a Harvard dropout, streetwear enthusiast, and design savant. As you'll hear, she has an uncanny knack for identifying brands that have successfully achieved story aesthetic match. Sara, welcome to The Deep End.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I want to start with a funny tweet that Webb Smith, the head of 2PM, who also appeared on the show a few months back, put out, which was drop the E from e-commerce. It's cleaner. It's obviously a reference to Justin Timberlake as Sean Parker in The Social Network, describing dropping the from Facebook. But it gets to an idea which is really important as we're talking about e-commerce, which is that increasingly as we're moving deeper and deeper into this COVID period, it's unclear what we should refer to this as. The line between a business being an in-person retailer and an online retailer, e-commerce, is getting smaller and smaller. So from your perspective, what is e-commerce today? And is there a delineation between the in-person aspect and the online aspect to the same degree that there was before COVID?
Yeah, I actually really like that kind of analogy you made, because I think the E in e-commerce, like the way people treat it, is really telling. Like some people capitalize it, some people have E-commerce. At some point, I think we really should get rid of it, because the way people think about commerce these days is how do we like manage logistics? How do we manage like coordinating our different acquisition channels? All of that is like pretty online. Even before we really started thinking about e-commerce platforms, like during the pandemic, Shopify really got big in the general public's eyes. But like even before that, people were thinking about digital marketing and all of that. And that's kind of e-commerce. And so I do think like nowadays people are more aware of the like line blurring between online shopping and in person, because oftentimes you see like these QR codes, your like in-store experiences starting to like be very tied to your online experience, since you have like the same like customer profile that the store should be aware of across their different channels, right? For example, with loyalty points or even like the support tickets you file. I think it's really interesting these days that the in-person shopping experience is starting to feel more like a showroom. You're seeing a lot more of these like aggregation, or like show fields, for example, is a really good example, where it feels like a museum almost. You go kind of take a look at the products, they switch it out every now and then. I do think the in-person shopping experience will serve like a different purpose over time.
Yeah, I live in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. So I am very, very deeply engaged in the storefront as showroom space. To give people context, because you run a company, Alloy, that, as you referred to it as, is really a COVID baby. Could you describe the world if you were a retailer in March 2020? What did the world look like for that retailer? Did they think, hey, I've got some time to figure out the e-commerce part? Maybe you have traditional mall brands maybe struggling, but maybe you have a path. So describe the world that they were looking at right before the pandemic hit. And then it'd be great for you to describe the world that your customers are now facing today.
Yeah, I do think a lot of retailers in March 2020 were aware of the need to like shift online because, with every year you saw more e-commerce penetration during like Black Friday. But I think the thing that really changed was the urgency of it in March 2020 and after, because there were so many things like logistically you had to figure out. For example, I think logistics is like literally the best example because I think that hasn't been figured out. You see a ton of tweets these days about the cost of containers like skyrocketing. And I think a lot of stores still haven't really figured out how to predict demand in like their online channels and how they want to then deal with, for example, like pre-orders and all of that online. And so I think, urgency really shifted because of the pandemic. I also think now this really ties in what I'm doing at Alloy, because you have to think about how the different tools you use link up. Because before the pandemic, people would have like their loyalty program set up, and it would be maybe like, you check out in person, it goes to the same profile as if you checked out online. And that was one unifying thing. But oftentimes the customer profile would not like link up across the different tools. Like, for example, like the support desk and like your, for example, returns requests, like they wouldn't be like linked to the same like customer profile for whatever reason. There's a lot of stuff behind the scenes that I can kind of dig into, but all of that became more important when so much volume started to go through like the e-commerce stores. And I think that's what the pandemic really changed for a lot of brands.
I'm really curious about your references to the logistics part of e-commerce, because something that every audience member will viscerally feel, whether or not they are in the e-commerce space or not, is the fact that it feels like everything's delayed. Orders aren't going out at the same rate that they were going before. Does that have anything to do with the ability to automate or arrange things better? I'm just curious how you think about that.
Yeah, I think the point of automation, at least, is to streamline operations and like even get the data to predict like demand from customers so that you can, better like request restocks further in advance or like at the right times. Because oftentimes I think before the pandemic, most brands didn't think about their data and like how they should use that to inform their decisions. And now like you have all these tools and you actually have the ability to do more of that. I think it's pretty like correlated, all of these like logistics issues with brands like struggling to adopt like these new tools and like managing their data.
And that's a good place, as you said, to get into what Alloy is doing. So yeah, could you explain at a very literal level, because I had a hard time visualizing what you're describing in the TechCrunch piece discussing y'all's fundraise. But yeah, just describe what Alloy does and get into the broader context.
Yeah, so Alloy, you can think of us as like a Zapier for e-commerce, because we are basically connecting different apps you use and letting you say, for example, you can have your loyalty app like Yotpo, and you can have your, let's say, like subscriptions app like Recharge. So you can link those up and create a workflow that says if there are like 10 subsequent renewals in a year for a customer. So let's say I buy like Cometeer. If I've renewed it 10 times consecutively, like Recharge can detect that, but they aren't the ones who reward you points or like give you gifts. So then I have to link up that data to Yotpo, my loyalty app, to then reward the points and then give you like an add-on gift on your 10th subscription. So we let brands like create those automated workflows that link up actions across their different apps so that you can have a great customer experience or a streamlined, logistics experience behind the scenes. So they're primarily marketing and ops use cases for this type of automation tool.
This may be obvious. I'm curious. There's the ever popular quote about bundling and unbundling being a really useful way to make money on the internet. Why are all these tools separated in the first place? Because as a novice to the e-commerce space, it seems like there should be Why can't there just be a platform where your loyalty points thing is managed, your subscription thing is managed? Why are these tools so separated in the first place?
Yeah, I've actually thought a lot about that because there's like all these different ways to think about abstraction. Like, sure, you can have like a loyalty app that also does gift cards, or should you like, abstract away gift cards and like loyalty points and all these different things into like mini apps, right? There are different approaches. I think from our perspective, from just like the data, like a loyalty system, they track based on like your points, your like customer email versus let's say a subscriptions app, they have like these different like customer attributes they like care about and kind of structure differently. And so that's why it actually is tough to like bundle certain functionality together. Those aren't actually two good examples. I'd say it's actually like you can compare, say, loyalty apps with like support apps. Like the support apps are very ticket based versus customer profile based. And that's why it's actually hard to like link them into one app.
Fascinating. And this also goes to a tweet that you put out, which was, for context, which I'd love to have you expand on because I'm just reading your tweets out loud to a certain degree, the customer acquisition cost for retailers on platforms like Facebook, Instagram, et cetera, is going up. So you made the point that given that fact, the need to focus on the overall lifetime value of customers is getting much more and more and more. So obviously the loyalty points, subscriptions, et cetera, et cetera. Can you talk about that space and how they're thinking about that in context?
Yeah, I think a lot of brands are starting to realize that it matters more that you're focused on making more money from your existing customers than to like try to just acquire a lot more that don't spend as much. I also think with D2C, right, there's a lot more loyalty there. Like you're choosing for example, an Allbirds for a reason. Like most of these D2C brands have just like a few SKUs when they start out or just like one product. And so you really like that. And ideally, if you're a D2C brand, you're really like milking that interest. Like you understand exactly what the customer wants. You can produce a new product or introduce like subscriptions or other things that will keep them and increase their LTV. And I think with all these like new acquisition channels or increasing costs, like you do have to focus on how you're treating your existing customers so that they don't get bought by another brand. Essentially, really nowadays people are just buying customers.
Why is the customer acquisition cost going up?
A part of it actually is there's so much money in, so much funding dollars going into D2C brands that people can afford to just like burn on like Facebook and Instagram ads. Nowadays, I think it's just a lot of smarter people are getting into like brands and starting these sorts of things. And at first, like it was really good. You put in like $1 into like say marketing and you could figure out the ROI. And then like you had this like consistent way of acquiring customers that made sense for your like product. But I think as more people started to figure that out, like it just got more expensive. So it's not an easy game anymore. And that's why the game has turned to like LTV. And once people figure that out, I think there's going to be a whole other thing you have to optimize for.
Something I'm curious about, given your perspective as a founder who works in the e-commerce space, but also as someone who has actually worked with streetwear brands before, what makes a good D2C company/brand? You also tweeted, you run a good Twitter, so I'm going to keep on referencing those. You tweeted about athletic greens, which just stuck out to me because I see and hear athletic greens everywhere. And you were talking about how it was successful despite not being the vibiest company to ever exist. So how do you think about that? Because you're also very interested in design and framing and those bits too.
Yeah, I think there's like a couple components. I'm a like huge like design and aesthetics nerd, so I generally think it's important for a brand to have like a story and like a matching aesthetic, but Athletic Greens kind of broke that. So I was like, why is it so successful? I do think there's a lot in its like marketing where they use like athletes, the Olympic medalists, like they tell that story. And like influencers and micro influencers are still super important. Like even though costs are still going up to like get them to be ambassadors, I think if you use it and like leverage them well, you can be like an Athletic Greens or like Princess Polly, they just filed for like IPO or whatever. A lot of these brands, they've figured out exactly the ICP of their like customers, and they just especially target the right influencers. And I think that works out. It's still really important for brands to like tell the story and like the origin stories. I know there's like some bad examples, like that cookware brand. I forgot what it's called, but they had this like this tear down. I think if it's done well, you can still be successful. And like, you need that core like fan base. I think Athletic Greens has a great fan base of athletes that, and everyone who wants to be like them now takes it.
Let's lean into your design background a little more because this is interesting to me because everyone talks about how there was this period from 2014 to roughly 2018, 2019, where it seemed like every single D2C startup had the same exact letterhead, everything basically blended together. Could you just as a design person talk about that phenomenon and where it's going? Because it's clearly not the thing now, but it's unclear what the thing is.
I feel like there's that whole like piece about brands that made people really think about the D2C brands they're purchasing. And I agree that there's way too much like pastel last year, but I'm starting to see like a big like rejection of that actually. So I think you have brands like maybe like Starface or more niche. Like there's some streetwear brands like Vandy the Pink or the ones where you like go onto their online storefront and you're like, wow, this is like messy, chaotic, and like none of the letters even like have like some semblance of a typeface. And I think that's starting to be like that new aesthetic, but it is the other extreme. So I think there's like these waves and brands who are trying to capture a specific, like right now, very focused on like the Gen Z. Like I think there's a lot of TikTok brands and they're just trying to fit that like messy aesthetic. So I think that'll be the next like 1 to 2 years.
That's funny. So let's get to your actual customer profile because producer Jackson and I were discussing beforehand and we're saying, are they focused on small businesses? We're talking about D2C customers here. Who are you serving?
We started out with Shopify Plus brands, actually. I think generally people who are running like 10-person plus D2C brands start to see some like role division of like marketers or even like retention and growth marketing. You see like an e-commerce manager at large. You see someone focused on logistics. And so those are the types of people we like to target with an automation tool since they have a set of apps they use. So for example, if you run logistics, a D2C brand, you might be using ShipBob as your 3PL, Returnly as your like returns logistics provider, and like Gorgeous as your customer support desk. And with those, we can suggest like these workflows for you to like optimize like how you're handling return requests and like labels being sent to customers over text. Or if you're focused on retention marketing, you probably use like Recharge and Yotpo and those sorts of things. So we really focused on those types of brands because they're starting to be more thoughtful about their whole like tech stack. And that's when we coined the term because they were like considering more hard tech tools like Segment, right? But we started to like focus on them and provided them the tool they needed that wasn't too deep in the code. And because most of these brands actually don't have dedicated in-house engineers because it doesn't make sense if you're a brand to focus on that. And so we kind of fit in this like middle where instead of paying for an agency and like paying a lot to like build these custom apps or like scripts to do the work, or even just using like a Zapier to stitch things together but not do the like complex like logic they needed, we were able to like serve that need. And I think at that point when we first started like 2 years ago, most brands were still not looking for this type of tool. But once we started serving the D2Cs, and as the pandemic went on, like the timing was really good for like an automation tool for e-commerce because younger brands started to realize that they need to invest in more like software. And so the budgets there increased as well as like for large retailers. And they looked to the like D2C brands that were like often in the news doing well in e-commerce and they wanted to like replicate what they were doing. And so because we got in at that time and focused on that like core, like sexy subset of like brands, like I think we're able to grow because of that.
Yeah, it's funny. I was going to ask you a question about how exactly you articulate the case for using your tools, but I just got stressed out at the image of all these different things not being stitched together. So it seems actually kind of self-explanatory to a certain degree, but because to your point, it's not as if these places are heavy with engineers. To what degree are e-commerce companies over 10 employees thinking about no-code tools? Is that language that they are aware of? How does that generally look from your perspective?
I don't think people are thinking of no-code tools. I think that's not really terminology they use. So actually, it's funny that you mentioned you're stressed because both in our like fundraising deck and our sales deck, we have this image of this whole tangle of e-commerce apps that are, it's like a very common like store stack. And you have these like lines connecting them, lots of like overlapping lines that should not exist. And then we have the next slide showing like, hey, this is how Alloy coordinates all of it. So I think that type of image makes it really clear to like brand owners, like, wow, like I do not need to be figuring out how I like export this list of order like fulfillment requests and then like pipe it into this other tool like myself. There's like that need that we fulfilled. And we basically, I think what was important for us to get to market was to like learn to speak in that like lingo, or like figure out how to pitch it so that we were solving the issues they were focused on and not pitching it as like a no code automation tool, because that is not how the brand owners think. So the way we like sell it is very different depending on if we're talking to a marketer or a brand, because for them, they're focused on like customer data and like maybe even customer data platforms, right? Or just like focused on how do I segment my email campaigns further and use past data to inform like the upsells we're doing. So those are the types of things we talk about there in that segment. And then with like, say, logistics or ops people, we're talking about some other stuff, but never really saying we're like doing no code automation for your brand.
You've alluded / mentioned this on the side, but I just want to get to it directly. Could you just describe, because you all have written about this in a really useful way, what is the stack for e-commerce businesses?
I don't want to like take the credit for it, but I feel like we almost started the trend of talking about this whole e-commerce stack concept. I think even pre-pandemic, there weren't as many tools. And so around like March 2020, you saw like this whole new surge of like e-commerce tools. Like SMS, there used to really only be like PostScript and Attentive, and now there's like 10 different apps in the market with at least like 30 mil in funding. And so on our website, we have this whole graphic called e-commerce stack. You can see it at runalloy.com/stack. And there's like at least like 15 layers, I'd say. So you have like the front end of your store. You have to think about how you want to like design and build the page. So you have page builders like Shogun. And then below that, you have like all these different like post-purchase forms. Like when you check out, you'll often notice like feedback surveys, like preference surveys you'll get, and that's powered by a separate tool. And then once you check out payment, there's like the BNPL options, the subscription options. There's also just like the classic checkout options like Bolt, right? And so those are 3 different sets of like payment tools. And so that's just like the start of your experience. Behind the scenes, once you make the purchase, there's like all sorts of things going on to power SMSs to you, emails, all of that. And so once you dig in, you'll see that the stack it's pretty extensive. I think e-commerce stores, like the tech behind them, is starting to really look like a SaaS business.
That's fascinating. So before you went directly into the e-commerce space, and correct me if my history is incorrect here, you and your co-founder actually were focused on a version of this company that was called LeadGem, which was more about automation and no-code tools for, and I don't know what this word means. I did not look it up before, so I'd love for you to define it, for prosumers. What is a prosumer?
That's funny that you dug so deep, because not many people remember we were called LeadGems, since it was just like a month when we first launched on Product Hunt. So basically, we're a bit of background on us. We're both like open source developers before, so that's how we met. I'd been more of a designer like later on, and we were interested in building a more prosumer version of Zapier. And what that means is like, we thought Zapier was still a bit hard for like a regular person to use. And we thought there was a world where our moms and dads could like use this automation tool, or anyone could just use it for their daily life. Because I think not many people actually use Zapier to power their daily lives if they're not in like tech. And so at the time, like this was October 2019, Superhuman, some of these other ones like Command E, they were really talking about the prosumer revolution of like SaaS tools. And so that's why we pitched it as like a Zapier for prosumers. And when we first launched on Product Hunt, you might see like there are a couple use cases. E-commerce was one of them, but we had like creators, like founders, and a bunch of different profiles that were not e-commerce focused.
And what caused you, I could kind of guess this, but what caused you to really lean into the e-commerce part of that?
Yeah, so we actually we did YC with like a very general focus still, but as we kind of went on, we discovered like we really need to focus on a specific use case for like marketing and sales, and we can't just be like, we're going to do everything for you and just try to sell to everyone. I think eventually you could probably do that, but we realized we should just hone in on one thing. And I run like a small like streetwear brand on the side, and personally was interested in e-commerce, so figured like we'd start there. We added Shopify as an integration in like February 2020, and back then like the app approval process was super quick, so we just like started diving into that. And as we went on, like that's when we started to discover like, wow, there's a lot of tools in this ecosystem. I think like, for example, if we'd focused on creators, like now might be a good time, but 2 years ago, I think there weren't as many creator economy tools. And so I think timing was also very good for e-commerce then.
Yeah. So let's actually speak about that before we get into your background, which is interesting in this context. Can you really talk about, in very literal terms, because you all did a good write up on this on your blog, how the e-commerce industry really took off during the pandemic from a company's perspective? I think the GMV, correct me on my acronyms, really expanded. Can you just define that for the audience? Because I forgot. Wait, gross merchandise by volume. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, it would just be great to speak about the actual industry in literal terms.
From like a consumer perspective or like software.
Oh, just how big did, because we're talking about, you're making this shift during YC, which we'll get into in a second. Like, what was just the spike that you just saw and that the industry saw during all of this?
Yeah, I'd say we're very lucky because we got into e-commerce before that spike happened, but I think you could see it in a lot of like graphs. This was like basically, I think Black Friday of 2020 made it very clear, but even before then, like people were bored at home. They're starting to make more purchases during like summer 2020. So I think you really saw just user or like purchases on Shopify like skyrocketing. Both Amazon and Shopify grew a ton over the pandemic, BigCommerce, Magento as well. And I think Shopify started to I think they recently started slowly overtaking Amazon by some metric, which is interesting, but I don't think that's going away. I know growth has slowed a tiny bit as like the world has opened up, but I think the new norm is still to have some sort of e-commerce store infrastructure.
The last reference to a tweet of yours I'll make is you had this funny tweet calling out a report over 10 years ago where they referred to T-commerce, that being tablet commerce, a concept that doesn't particularly make sense in today's context. So it'd be great for you to, A, just talk about at a meta level trends and predictions that people either got right or got wrong. And B, we haven't even talked about where most of this e-commerce is going on. So I personally am a very generic Instagram shopper now. A lot of things I buy come off of Instagram, so that's where I'm seeing it. But I'm consuming that content on my phone, not on an iPad or anything like that. So just to comment on trends and then also just how people are actually at the consumer level consuming things.
Yeah, I have actually a lot of thoughts because there's a ton of VC money like pouring into e-commerce software at large right now, not necessarily brands, but e-commerce software, you see a lot of investment going into like mobile app builders and SMS and subscriptions and BNPL. I think BNPL is interesting because that does increase
BNPL.
Buy now, pay later tools like Affirm, Sezzle, those. I do think there's some good reports or brands see better conversion rates if they have those. So that's cool. I'm kind of doubtful. This will be kind of controversial, but SMS apps and mobile app builders, I personally don't have any brands mobile apps on my phone. Like you said, I purchased from Instagram or TikTok directly, or just the site. So that's interesting to me. I'm curious what will happen there with native iOS apps for specific brands. And then also SMS. I actually I don't have a single brand on SMS, but I think the amount of VC funding going into SMS apps has way outpaced some other areas of e-commerce. For example, I think page builders could probably Headless has gotten a decent amount of investment. I think customer support desk tools, I think Gorgeous is the main player, but I think those are pretty interesting because there's still a bit more room there.
So could you explain, because I obviously understand the native app on the phone. I always decline to do it because it just feels like another app. And this Chrome browser, if I'm even there, does a good enough job. So I'm actually fine with that. But what do you mean by SMS apps?
Yeah, I mean, right now there's a lot of tools in the space that basically help brands do SMS campaigns. You left something in your cart, come back and purchase it. You purchased this before. I recommend this as an upsell. Or do you want to opt into subscription? And I see a bunch of those tools and we work with a bunch of those tools, but as a consumer, I actually don't get many of those texts. And I am very curious what other people's experiences are. So that's an intriguing thing for me because I just wonder maybe there will be one or two winners in this space, but it doesn't seem like all venture-backed ones will pan out in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm just thinking about this because I actually do get these texts and I like it in the context of when I have a subscription product. So for example, whenever my razor needs to be renewed. Sometimes like I'll buy less razor blades than another month. So it's actually good to get a reminder, hey, this is about to happen. Go check your cart. And the same thing is true with, I buy pre-made meals during the week. So they'll say, hey, don't forget to check this on Thursday. And that's how I remember to do it. But I think in a clothing context, I'm a little less interested. And that would actually feel, this is actually useful. When it's a subscription thing, they're helping me. Don't buy things you don't want to buy. But when it's, hey, like there's this sale or, hey, something in your cart, that's not actually helping me with something.
Right. Yeah, that actually kind of goes back to your point about the bundling, where it's almost like SMS could be bundled into subscriptions apps or like certain other apps, and maybe just like independent standalone SMS apps might not need to exist.
Let's get to your bio, but kind of do it in reverse order because we've always started with YC. The reason why I'm interested in your biography is because listeners will know we don't typically go into this as much, which is that this entire conversation we're having is operating within a context of automation. And in your marketing copy and in TechCrunch, you actually talk about how companies who are in this space have been able to meet hiring shortages or actually like change the nature of their teams because they actually are able to automate themselves more effectively. And you actually included a reference to the fact that you all were hiring a automation engineer. And that's something that more and more companies are going to hire moving forward. And that could actually become its own actual internal org within a place. So I'm interested in your career in terms of how you, as a white collar professional, are making these choices. So let's just start with YC. What was and you actually went through YC at a really interesting point. So you were in person and then not in person, and just talk about YC and how you really found it.
Yeah. How we found it, you said?
Oh, no. Yes. Yeah. I could guess how you found YC. How your experience.
Yeah. I was like, I don't know, actually. It's been so long. Yeah. We were the last in-person batch in winter 20. So that was crazy. We were definitely like the youngest in our batch. And so it was like a really good, like challenging time. Demo day got not canceled, but it was like the format was changed super last minute. But what was interesting about our batch was like how many automation and no-code startups there were. It was a very popular like type of startup. And I think there are a couple other themes. So it's really cool to just like look at the theme of every batch. But I thought it was a great experience still. Like the hiring network is great. And to sort of talk to your second point of like automation engineers and like what that means for the job economy, I have some thoughts there where I don't think it's like replacing jobs. I do think these no-code automation tools are just changing like the landscape of jobs. Like there will be, I think ultimately, everyone is a programmer at the end of the day. We're all using like some form of tech and just configuring it to our needs. Like even if you're using spreadsheets, like 40 years ago, no one was using spreadsheets, right? So it's like we've like kind of adapted to the new tech. And at some point in like 20, 30 years, it's we won't even think about no code automation as like this like tech or like this difficult thing to configure. It'll be like one of those baseline skills like spreadsheet configuration these days. So yeah, I do think automation is just another like process of abstracting and making easier jobs or like different types of jobs that'll make the world more efficient.
And something that's interesting to bookend the YC story was y'all's decision to forego demo day. So I'm curious, just on a personal level, like why you made that decision. You're obviously able to fundraise, so it's not as if you were out in the cold. But I'm also just curious because if I remember something from that March, April moment, there was so much uncertainty regarding what funding was going to look like and how this could change this or that thing. So just the fact that you all made that decision not to do the thing that most people think as of the most prominent YC thing, that feels riskier than it ended up being. So I'm curious how you think about that.
A lot of people ask us about this, and maybe I have just a weird way of thinking, but I personally thought about the brand of our company and being in that demo day where you just threw your slide online and everyone was looking at it during this like crazy moment in time where no one would actually care about your pitch. I thought that would do more damage to the brand to like just have that little slide than to like actually go out and tell our story like direct to investors. So I think that actually led to maybe a quicker and slightly more successful fundraise, although it was still a really tough time.
But what do you mean by damage to the brand? To especially someone who hasn't gone through a YC type process, what was your concern at the investor level of what that would be?
maybe that sounds more intense than it actually is. I generally just think a lot about the perception of our company, like online or just, everywhere. And I think having like, I kind of operate actually from the like mentality of like running like a streetwear brand. Like if you put yourself in that, like I think there were like 250 like companies that batch, and you just had to throw up your slide and like people just scroll through and like it just turns into like a blur, right? You're like one among this like flurry of startups that no one really cares to fund when the stock markets are crashing. Like I thought that it was worse to be included there than to be one of the few that didn't do that. And then, now people like think about that. They're like, why didn't you do it? And it's actually like people think more about that than the fact that if we'd done it, like they wouldn't really question it. So I think it had like the inverse effect. The exclusivity of not doing it was more interesting, I thought.
Which is a trick which people can only do once. Let's actually talk about not your work in streetwear, but just how your interest in the space informs your thought broadly as a founder. Because I think streetwear is really, really interesting. I think it all falls into this debate about how are people going to dress and look post-pandemic. It seems like everyone right now is dressing surprisingly well. I think we got tired of sweatpants for a second, but just would love to hear your broad just streetwear thoughts.
As it ties to the company, I do think like I really like how brands, especially streetwear brands, are like much more authentic. They're kind of erratic, they have like the drops. I think it's become more systematized recently where you have the sneakers app and there's like raffles and like there's dates when things drop. But before, like real streetwear brands is kind of like, oh, like the person who ran the brand just felt like or got inspired by something and wanted to drop something, and it just like dropped, and people who really cared about the brand followed it and then caught those drops. And the value of it like grew over time, and like others who got into the brand later on would be like, oh my God, I wish I had that piece. We run the company a bit like similarly, where we used to not post super frequently to social, but for some reason a lot of like people followed us, and like I'm honestly not sure how Alloy got a following, because I get messages from students. Yeah, and like I've gotten messages from like high school students who are like, I'm super into e-commerce automation, and I'm like, how did you hear? Like I did not know what e-commerce automation was in high school, not even in college. And so it's just cool because I think streetwear like brands have a similar effect where people just really fall in love with them and like don't even know what the original ethos was, or like, most people who are into streetwear don't skate these days or surf or like whatever. But I think it's like a cool distribution strategy almost.
A theory I'd posit as to why you get young people reaching out to you is that you're a very young founder who met your co-founder when you were in high school and dropped out of Harvard, which obviously goes to that biography point. But I'm curious, as we'll get to Harvard and institutions in a second, do you think that there are spaces that would be unfriendly to you in terms of your ability to succeed and advance in them, given your background? So it seems like e-commerce, especially during COVID, was a space that you actually were able to enter into. I'm curious, how broad do you think that capacity is?
I think I'm lucky that these days, Silicon Valley tech, most spaces are pretty open to like people who don't look like the majority, or like people who don't have a deep background in that space. For example, I don't have the 10 years at LVMH that some people do. Actually, it's funny. Maybe this is a funny anecdote, but a lot of people, they start out learning to code, and they'll have a question and they post it on Stack Overflow and they get a bunch of shit from the people on Stack Overflow. So that was my first experience with tech. It's only gotten better from there.
How old were you when that happened?
I was like 14, and I was like, why are people shitting on me for asking about this like error log? And like, I didn't care that much, but it was still like pretty funny that like people were just kind of rude on like those online forums. But over time, that's just gotten better. I think there's way more young role models these days and like people in all sorts of spaces. So I'm grateful for that. I think I haven't really seen much, like no one is rude or excludes people in like certain spaces anymore.
You just moved to New York City. And as we're talking about your background and where you were growing as a founder, you were coming from the Bay Area. And I would just love your thoughts, because you were tweeting about this, just about New York, the Bay Area, where people are placed. There's the reason why this is such an interesting discussion is that, especially to those young people who are reaching out to you about e-commerce in these spaces, the question of where do you go has been super expanded, but because it's been expanded so much, there's a million different options, which increases the difficulty there. So I'd just love to hear why you came to New York and how you think about the general dispersion of Silicon Valley.
Yeah, I do really think it's happening. And like you just said, it is important for like young people to be somewhere physically where they feel the energy of like the industry they're choosing. And that was SF for me when I was like 16 or 17. Like I would fly into SFO and like feel that. I think that still exists. I still see there are these houses. Those are actually great opportunities for young people to like get into a house of people and like have that community and like network across different cities, I think, with some of these hacker houses. But New York is a really great place for crypto these days, fintech, and like e-commerce software because it's like the place where some of these things converge. Silicon Valley or like, the Bay, I think still holds a place for certain types of SaaS. So tech is starting to go to different cities depending on what like niche within tech you're looking for. LA for like creator tech, which I think is really cool actually. So for young people, I think you actually have like more choice, which does make it hard because you have to commit to a city and like a like subject area that you probably will have to stick to if you're going to like settle there or be a digital nomad, which I see a lot of young people doing these days. So I think you actually don't have to pick. But I spent like 3 years in SF and think it's time for New York, especially because a lot of our customers are in New York and LA. So we're just going close to the customer.
Put yourself back in your youngest version of yourself. How do you pick a subject matter? Because I'm a creator, so I'm obviously interested in the creator economy, but I didn't even think about that. And I'm 29 years old. Creator economy, Web3, fintech. You're clearly someone who acts and keeps options open, but I just really struggle, just in the same way that people struggle with saying, hey, I'm going to major in this, or that when you're 19 or 20. It seems short-term correct that you should say, hey, I'm going to lean into this one topic. There are plenty of mutual people who we both know who very clearly in their early 20s said, I'm going to be the Web3 person, or I'm going to be the NFT person, this, or that. But long-term, I wonder if a consequence of that is the old cut off openness to different avenues. So how do you just think about that?
Honestly, for this one, I don't even know if I have an answer because I almost feel like Alloy found me and I've committed to it for the next few years. And it's just a convergence of like what I like a subject I'm interested in, and I'm happy with it. When I was 17, maybe I was struggling a lot with like what industry I would want to focus in, like if that was like fintech, crypto, like those types of things, but also like function. Like, do I want to be a designer, engineer? Like there's all these choices now that I feel like young people are like struggling with as, I think people are more aware of careers earlier and earlier on, and people shouldn't be scared of like pigeonholing themselves because I've seen so many people suddenly jump into crypto and become like experts overnight. And I don't think I think people these days are more open to different backgrounds. Like I alluded to earlier, like there's not as much exclusion. You can be a newbie to a space and your advantage is like a fresh perspective. So it's not as critical to say, build a resume in like fintech engineering as it was before.
Let's get to Harvard. So you spent a year there.
Mm-hmm.
You've discussed this in other venues, so we're not going to hit anything particularly game changing here, I'm betting. But just, what was the decision like to drop out? Because then you like went and worked, at a bunch of different startups. You did a bunch of different things. Because it was there's a multi-year gap between when you started Alloy and dropped out. So this wasn't Zuckerberg leaves to do Facebook. This wasn't Bill Gates leaves for Microsoft. You just did different things. So I'm curious how you thought about that.
This is kind of bad, but I tell people I don't really have great, I don't think about my end goal and run towards it. I kind of have this just if I enjoy doing it, I'll keep doing it approach. Since I just like building and I'll build things. And I think that's what's brought a lot of good things towards me. So basically my path, I was at Harvard for a year. I actually studied a lot of history there. I didn't really take CS. I dropped my CS course after 2 weeks of a grind. And I had a good time there. But I think after first year, I was a bit tired of school. So tired of just having assignments. And I was out in SF before college, actually, like helping at Do Not Pay and with Josh Browder. And so I wanted to like go back to that sort of building mindset. So I went back. I was doing like an internship at Snap and then changed my mind and wanted to do design. So I was at another company, and Alloy was like one in a series of like side projects I'd worked on throughout the years. And so I didn't think of it as the startup that would lead me to leave school. It was the project that just more people were interested in, somehow blew up online, got us funding. And then slowly over time, it just was clear to me school served no place in my life. So that stuff like happened and it was never a concrete decision. But I'd say like maybe it was after a seed that I started to realize that.
How do you think about the brand building? Not that that's what you're doing, but there's this, joke on Twitter, which is that, the smart thing to do is to get into Stanford, don't pay your tuition, just drop out on the first day. So that you could say you're a Stanford dropout or a Harvard dropout in your case. How do you just think at a more meta level about people's increasing acceptance and interest in folks who clearly demonstrate they have the ability to get the credential, but don't do the credential themselves?
Yeah, I think there's all sorts of people who do that. I'd say it's hard to like generalize and say like what motivates people to like drop out, get like certain credentials. I do think a lot of the general public, they're trying to spot the next like Zuckerberg or like whoever, because it's always fun to say like, oh, like you knew like this person would be like that. I think my general philosophy has been to just do things I enjoy, and like I don't really think too hard about like the public perception, because that ends up just giving you a lot of pressure. And like after leaving school, actually, it was a tough time. Like I didn't really have friends my age. There's a lot more going on behind the scenes. And most people who like leave school will realize that and like stop doing things for like credentials. Like I've seen a lot of like people in my cohort, like not care less, but like do more things for themselves after dropping out. And I think that is like a great like side effect of like leaving school and like learning these things about yourself. So yeah, I think that's kind of how I think about it.
I like the effective advice of don't do it for the vibes, do it because you're actually looking for something. We've found just increasing interest in all these like Web 2, Web 3 conversion conversations. I haven't really seen it discussed in the e-commerce space sense. I'm curious if that is me just overly trying to fit Web3 into a narrative conversation, or if there's something there. I would just love your broad thoughts, because this is basically just, it's really fascinating to see something just pop up in the zeitgeist just to the level that this Web3 conversation has.
I actually think Web3 and e-commerce will be, I think there's a lot of synergy there. So you're not like overreaching or anything. I think e-commerce at the end of the day is the exchange of money for goods, whether that is like crypto or like real, like, currency, USD, or digital goods or physical goods. So I think e-commerce actually has a really central place in this like shift. I've seen like Shopify starting to focus on that. They have a crypto team now with MetaMask and some of these other tools. They're making it way easier to like link your digital like wallets and whatnot to your e-commerce experience, and then help you like claim your both physical and virtual goods. So I think it'll be a really interesting time for e-commerce this next year as well. So there's going to be a whole new onslaught of like tools that are going to serve that.
For the last actual question here, the thing that really attracted me to the Web3 conversation that's separate from just the narrative one or the faddish part is this idea that Web3 is about really fulfilling the promise of the internet and throwing away things that were just built up over time but don't actually make sense. Can you think about anything in that context that applies to e-commerce? Are there any practices that have built up over the past 2 generations of the internet that you think if we were to reconstruct everything or adapt new assumptions, we should focus on?
Ooh, yeah, I kind of see where you're getting at least in e-commerce. It will be like the way we like, I think it kind of ties more to consumer psychology of purchasing and like, do I want to like allocate my like monthly budget to this physical luxury good, or do I want to go into like this brand's virtual world and like own this? So I think that's kind of where e-commerce and like Web3 will like converge and like the tools around that.
That is very interesting and a great place for folks to continue diving into. Sara, thank you so much for joining us. The last statement would be, is there anything you'd like to shout out, people should look towards and go next?
Yeah. I'm always going to plug Alloy. So if you're an e-commerce merchant or even like a drop shipper, you should definitely check us out. So runalloy.com.
Great. Thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us in the deep end. If you enjoyed your stay, give us a review on Apple Podcasts and share this episode with your friends and colleagues to help grow the show with us. We've also got show notes and more episodes available at ideas.beyonddeck.com. See you next time.